In this lesson, we're going to talk about the concepts of execution and escalation attacks. Now, when we talk about attacks against software code, usually these attacks are going to attempt to execute some kind of attacker's code within your system. And the way they do that is by exploiting some kind of a vulnerability. Now, when we talk about this section, we're really going to focus on a couple of key areas. We're going to talk about arbitrary code execution, remote code execution, privilege escalation, and rootkits. Now, when we talk about arbitrary code execution, this is a vulnerability that allows an attacker to run their own code or a module that exploits such a vulnerability. Now, essentially, they're able to run what they want on your system without you stopping them. That's what we mean by arbitrary code execution, because they're being able to run the things they want to run, which is against what you want to run, and therefore it's arbitrary. Now, another thing we can look at is what's known as remote code execution. Now, remote code execution is like arbitrary code execution. In fact, it's a type of that. But this is really a vulnerability that allows an attacker to transmit code from a remote host for execution on a target host or a module that exploits such a vulnerability. So, if I can touch your machine and load up my software, that's arbitrary code execution. If I can do it over the internet, that's remote code execution. That's the difference between these two. Now, the next thing we want to talk about is privilege escalation. Now, we've mentioned the term privilege escalation earlier when we talked about threat hunting. One of the things bad guys want to do is they want to be able to operate at higher levels of privilege. And that's what privilege escalation is all about. This is going to occur when a user accesses or modifies specific resources that they're not entitled to normally access. So, if I'm going to do a privilege escalation, what I'm trying to do is attempt to gain administrator or root level permissions. That's the holy grail for these folks. In fact, if they can get a domain admin, that's even better. Now, when we talk about privilege escalation, we can really break this down into two types of escalation. The first is vertical privilege escalation. This is where somebody goes from a normal user and goes to a higher level. So they're going to go to an admin or a root level. When you hear privilege escalation, this is normally what most people think about. They think about a bad guy getting you to click a link in a spear phishing email, that then runs some kind of arbitrary code. That code then gives them escalated rights to be able to be the admin of that local system. That's a vertical privilege escalation. Now, if we're talking about the second type, this is known as horizontal privilege escalation. This occurs when a user accesses or modifies resources they're not entitled to, but it's generally at the same level. So, for example, if I'm on the shared drive and I'm trying to access George's file and I don't have George's permission, that would be horizontal privilege escalation. If I ran some kind of exploit that gave me permissions to run as a different user, such as George, even though he's not an admin or a root, that's why it's considered horizontal. We both have user permissions at the same level, but he has permissions over his stuff. I have permissions over my stuff. So I might need to break into his account to be able to do that. And in that case, that would be a horizontal privilege escalation. Now, why are privileges so important? Well, it's because every application or process has to have some kind of privileges to read and write data and execute those functions. Now, because those applications have permissions to run their functions and be able to execute functions and read and write data, if we're able to break into that application, we can run things as that application as well. So, for example, some applications and some system processes run using the system account. And so if I can break into that particular application and put some arbitrary code in there, my code is now being run as system. And this allows me to do some sort of a hack or attack against that system. So whenever you're running something and somebody's able to put arbitrary code into it, that arbitrary code is going to take the privileges of whoever was running that program. So if Jason's running that program, it has Jason's permission. If the system was running that program, it has the system permission. If an admin was running that program, they have admin permissions. And so again, this is another way that privilege escalation can occur. Now, the last thing we want to talk about is rootkits. Now, rootkits should be something that you're familiar with from your Security Plus studies, and this is just going to be a review for you. A rootkit is essentially a class of malware that modifies system files, often at the kernel level, to conceal its presence. Now, when we're dealing with a rootkit, this is something that is really scary for a lot of people. Why? Because when a rootkit gets into that system, it can hide itself. They are very hard to detect. Now, a lot of times, once you have a rootkit installed, this means the attacker can now hide themselves in your system. They can install other software like malware. They can create persistence between your computers, even if you start rebooting it or shutting it down. They can even maintain persistence between user logoff events and other things like this. Now, when you're dealing with rootkits, you have to understand what are we talking about, because there are different types of rootkits. Now, before we can get into the different types, though, we really have to talk about the idea of rings and the way that systems are built. When we're dealing with a computer, there are multiple rings going from the most privileged to the least privileged. The ring 0 is the center of the computer. This is the kernel. This is where the heart of the operating system lies. And this kernel can be a Windows kernel or a Linux kernel. If you're operating something with kernel level permissions, you're at ring 0. You have the most privileged access to this machine. And so if I can get a rootkit that embeds itself into the kernel, that means I have ring 0 access. Now, if I have some kind of a rootkit that attaches itself to a device driver, that might be ring 1 or ring 2. If it's going after an application, it might be ring 3. And the further out you are, the less privileges you're going to have. So let's go back and look at our rootkits. What are the two types we have? Well, we have kernel mode and user mode. When we have a kernel mode rootkit, this is one that's at that ring 0. It's at the center. It has the most permissions. And so a kernel mode rootkit is able to gain complete control over your system. Now, if somebody couldn't get a kernel mode rootkit installed, they could only get a user one installed. This would be a user mode rootkit. And these might have administrator level privileges, but they're using the operating system features for persistence. So they have to be inside the registry. They have to be inside something like Task Scheduler. So that way, when you reboot the system, they get that persistence back. So which one's more dangerous? A kernel mode rootkit, because it's all the way down in ring 0. And therefore, that's going to be more dangerous for our systems.